Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Voice in the Vent. Jason Carter had never believed in ghosts. He was a rational man, an engineer who relied on facts and logic. So when he found an affordable apartment in an old building in Chicago, he didn't hesitate to sign the lease. It was a steal. The previous tenant had moved out suddenly, leaving the place half furnished. The landlord, an elderly man with deep-set eyes, seemed eager to have someone move in. Jason moved in on a rainy afternoon, carrying boxes up the narrow stairwell. The apartment was small but decent. One bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. But what stood out the most was the air vent, an old, rusted grate positioned high on the living room wall. It was larger than a typical vent, almost the size of a small window with thick, black slats. His first night was uneventful, save for the occasional creaking of the wooden floors. But as he lay in bed, just on the edge of sleep, he heard it, a whisper. At first he thought it was the wind, but the voice was unmistakably human. It was soft, almost pleading. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Jason sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound had come from the vent. He swallowed hard. "Who's there?" Silence. Convincing himself that it was just the building settling, Jason eventually drifted off to sleep. Over the next few days, Jason became increasingly aware of the voice. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, it always came around the same time, just past midnight. Sometimes it was a whisper, other times a low, urgent murmur. "Help me. Please don't leave me here." One night, he decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and climbed onto a chair, peering into the vent. The darkness inside was suffocating, like staring into a bottomless pit. He couldn't see anything, but the smell was unsettling, damp and metallic, like rust and something else, something rotten. He tapped the metal slats. "Who's in there?" No response. He was about to step down when a breathy sigh echoed from deep inside. Jason nearly fell off the chair. The next morning, he confronted his landlord. "That vent, does it connect to another apartment?" The old man's face darkened. "You've heard it, haven't you?" Jason hesitated. "What is it?" The landlord sighed, rubbing his temples. "You should leave it alone. That vent hasn't been connected to anything in years. It used to be part of an old duct system that was sealed off decades ago. No one should be in there." Jason frowned. "But I hear a voice." The landlord looked at him for a long moment. The last tenant, she heard it too. Jason's stomach tightened. What happened to her? The landlord hesitated. She left in the middle of the night. Never came back for her things. Just gone. Jason felt a chill crawl down his spine. That night, he couldn't ignore the voice any longer. It was clearer now. Jason. His blood ran cold. It knew his name. He grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and recorded as he approached the vent. "Who are you?" A pause, then a whisper. "Trapped. Please, help me." Jason's breath hitched. "Where are you trapped?" "Behind the vent. So dark, so cold." Something about the voice, soft, almost childlike, filled him with dread. His fingers trembled as he removed the rusted screws. The vent cover came loose with a screech. The darkness inside was vast, a hollow void that swallowed the light from his phone. He aimed a flashlight into the vent. At first, he saw nothing but dust and cobwebs. Then, movement. A pale hand shot out. Jason screamed, stumbling backward. The hand withdrew, disappearing into the blackness. His phone slipped from his grasp, landing near the opening. On its screen, the camera continued to record, catching something his eyes had missed. A face, half hidden in the darkness, gaunt and hollow-eyed, staring at him from the void. Jason fled the apartment that night and checked into a motel. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The next day, he did some digging. An old newspaper article revealed the horrifying truth. 30 years ago, a woman named Evelyn Mercer had gone missing from the apartment. Her abusive boyfriend had been the prime suspect, but the case was never solved. Neighbors reported hearing her screams, but the police found no evidence of foul play. Jason's stomach twisted as he read the last line. Authorities noted a foul odor coming from the apartment's air ducts, but after a thorough search, no body was found. The realization struck him like a hammer. Evelyn had never left. She had been trapped, hidden inside the very walls of the apartment. Jason knew he couldn't ignore it. He returned to the apartment with a crowbar and a flashlight. The voice greeted him the moment he stepped inside. "Jason, please." With a deep breath, he climbed onto the chair, shining his light deep into the vent. Then he saw it. Not just a hand, not just a face, a body, bones wrapped in tattered clothing, wedged deep inside the ductwork. Her empty eyes seemed to beg him for release. A wave of nausea hit him, but he forced himself to move. He called the police. The authorities arrived within hours. When they extracted the remains, the truth was finally revealed. Evelyn Mercer had been murdered, stuffed into the vent by the man who was supposed to love her. Her killer had died years ago, never facing justice. Jason moved out the next day. But on his last night in the apartment, as he packed his things, he heard it one final time. "Thank you." A whisper of relief, then silence. For the first time since he had moved in, the apartment felt still. Jason left, never looking back. But sometimes, late at night, he swore he could still hear it, the voice in the vent. Story 2. The Mirror That Lied. Maya never expected to inherit anything from her estranged grandmother, Madame Lestari. The old woman had lived alone in a secluded mansion deep in the forest, a place Maya had only visited once when she was a child. Her mother rarely spoke of her, and when she did, it was with a mix of fear and resentment. When the lawyer read the will, Maya was shocked. Among the property and antiques, one item stood out, a massive, ornate mirror that Madame Lestari kept in her bedroom. "You must never cover it," the lawyer warned, almost hesitantly, "and never break it." Maya frowned. "Why?" The lawyer hesitated before shaking his head. "I don't know, but she was very clear about that in her will." Despite the eerie instruction, Maya decided to move into the mansion. It was isolated, but she found its antique charm appealing. She was an artist, and she believed the solitude might help her creativity. The mirror, now hers, stood against the wall of the master bedroom. Its frame was made of dark wood, carved with strange symbols she couldn't decipher. At first, everything seemed fine, but then the mirror started lying. The first time it happened, Maya was brushing her hair at night. She noticed something odd in the reflection. Her lips were moving, but she wasn't speaking. She leaned closer. The reflection whispered, "Don't turn around." A chill ran down her spine. Against her better judgment, she turned. Nothing was there. She told herself it was just her imagination. The house was old, the wind howled through cracks, and she was tired, but the mirror continued to lie. One evening, She saw herself smiling in the mirror, even though her own lips were still. Another time, her reflection turned away before she did, as if it were moving independently. Then, things got worse. At night, she heard whispers from the mirror, words too faint to understand. Shadows moved in her peripheral vision, but when she looked, nothing was there. One night, as she lay in bed, she saw the mirror's surface ripple, as if it were made of liquid. Her reflection stood up while she remained lying down. It pressed a finger to its lips. "Shh! Don't wake up." Maya jolted upright, her heart racing. The reflection was normal again. She decided to cover the mirror. She didn't care about the warning in the will. Whatever was inside that mirror, she wanted nothing to do with it. As soon as she threw a cloth over it, a piercing scream echoed through the room. The walls trembled and the lights flickered. The cloth was ripped away by an unseen force. That night, she locked the bedroom and slept in the living room. Maya needed answers. She searched the mansion for any records of her grandmother's connection to the mirror. In the attic, she found an old diary. The entries spoke of the Juanita Kermin, the woman in the mirror. It was an ancient curse passed down in their bloodline. The mirror was not an object, it was a prison. The woman trapped inside was a deceiver, a parasite that fed on truth and replaced it with lies. Madame Lestari had spent her life keeping the entity contained, but now that she was gone, the woman was waking up. The final entry read, "She wants to take my place. She can't, as long as I watch her, but I grow old, weak. One day, she will find someone new." Maya's blood turned cold. The reflection, the smiles, the whispers, the lies, it was trying to take her place. That night, Maya decided to test something. She placed a camera facing the mirror and left the room. When she reviewed the footage, she nearly dropped the laptop. The reflection moved on its own. It left the frame, stepping out of the mirror. She turned slowly toward the bedroom. The door was ajar. A whisper slid into her ear. "I told you not to turn around." Maya ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, breathless, trembling. From the window, she saw herself standing in the bedroom, looking down at her with a smile. Her reflection had escaped. Maya never returned to the mansion. She went to the city, surrounded herself with people, and never looked into another mirror for weeks. But one evening, in a cafe restroom, she made a mistake. She glanced into the mirror. Her reflection smiled. Then, in a voice identical to hers, it whispered, "You're the reflection now." Story 3. The Stranger in the Photograph. Ethan Clarke never believed in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. He was a rational man, a freelance journalist who spent his time writing about real-life mysteries, missing persons, unsolved crimes, and historical oddities. His latest project led him to Ravenswood, a small, forgotten town deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where he planned to document the eerie history of the Winters estate, a long-abandoned mansion rumored to be haunted. The locals were reluctant to speak about it. Every time Ethan mentioned the mansion, their faces turned pale, and they muttered warnings about the curse of the Winters family. But it was an old woman named Martha Holloway who finally gave him something useful. "If you really want to understand what happened there," she said, her voice trembling, "look at the old photographs, the ones in the town archive." That was how Ethan found himself in the dimly lit Ravenswood Historical Society, sifting through dusty boxes of photographs and records. After hours of searching, he came across an old black and white photograph, dated 1892. It showed the Winters family, Reginald and Eleanor Winters with their 2 children, standing in front of their grand estate. But what made Ethan freeze was the man standing behind them. He wasn't part of the family. He wasn't listed in any records. But there he was, tall and gaunt, his face pale, his hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. His expression was unsettling, somewhere between a sneer and a grimace. But the worst part, the man in the photograph looked exactly like Ethan. Ethan couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. He stared at the photograph for hours, comparing his own reflection in his phone screen to the man in the picture. The resemblance was uncanny. Same sharp cheekbones, same deep-set eyes, same slight smirk. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. "This has to be a coincidence," he muttered. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan spent the next few days researching the Winters estate. The history was gruesome. The entire family was found dead in 1893, just a year after the photograph was taken. The official report said they had gone mad, attacking each other in a fit of hysteria. But locals whispered about the stranger in the photograph, claiming he had cursed them. Ethan dug deeper. The more he searched, the more he found other photographs, not just of the Winters family, but of other families from different decades. And in every single one, the same man was there standing just behind them. 1892, 1910, 1935, 1968, 1984. Same face, same expression, unchanged. And now, Ethan had found himself in the past. The more Ethan learned, the more he felt the weight of something pressing against his mind. He began to hear whispers at night, faint voices speaking in an old dialect he couldn't understand. His reflection in mirrors seemed off, lingering a fraction of a second too long after he moved. But he refused to stop. He drove to the Winters estate, now a decaying ruin deep in the forest. The air was thick with the scent of rotting wood and damp earth. He stepped inside, his flashlight flickering. The walls were covered in faded photographs, all featuring the stranger. Then he saw it, a massive mirror in the grand hall, and in its surface, standing right behind him, was the man from the photographs. Ethan turned sharply, but there was no one there. Yet, in the mirror, the man was grinning, his teeth too sharp, his eyes too hollow, and then the whispering grew louder. Ethan tried to run, but the house seemed to shift, trapping him. The air became thick, suffocating. He stumbled into what used to be the study, where an old, leather-bound journal lay open on the desk. The entries were written in his own handwriting. March 4th, 1892. The Winters family has welcomed me. They do not suspect a thing. April 17th, 1893. It is time. The hunger grows. May 1st, 1893. They are gone. Their souls are mine. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't possible. But as he flipped through the pages, he saw entries dating further and further back. Decades, centuries, and then the final entry. March 13th, 2025. Ethan Clark has arrived. He is ready. A sharp pain split through Ethan's skull. Memories, not his own, flooded his mind. He saw himself in different eras, standing behind countless families, watching, waiting. He remembered becoming the stranger in the photograph. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a cycle. And now, it was starting again. Ethan's body felt heavy as he looked into the mirror again. The stranger's reflection was now perfectly aligned with his own. His skin turned pale, his eyes hollowed, his lips curled into a smile he didn't control. He tried to scream, but the sound came out as a whisper. And then he understood. He had always been the stranger, and now he would wait until the next photograph was taken. Story 4. The Girl Who Knocks 3 Times. Lena had always been drawn to the eerie and the unexplained. It was no surprise that when she heard the rumors about the abandoned house at the edge of town, she felt compelled to investigate. The house had been empty for decades, but locals whispered about strange occurrences. Lights flickering in the windows despite no electricity, shadowy figures glimpsed at dusk, and most famously, the sound of 3 distinct knocks at the front door, always at midnight. No one ever answered. No one dared. Lena, being a skeptic, dismissed these tales as nothing more than superstition. Armed with her camera and flashlight, she decided to spend the night in the house, determined to prove there was nothing supernatural about it. Her best friend, Mark, tried to dissuade her. "This isn't some ghost hunting TV show, Lena," he warned. "People say whoever hears the knocking doesn't come back the same." She laughed. "Then it's a good thing I don't believe in ghosts." That evening, she packed her bag, kissed her worried mother goodbye, and set off toward the house as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was exactly as she expected, cold, decayed, and eerily silent. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs hung like forgotten lace. The wooden floor creaked under her feet as she set up her camera in the grand hall. Midnight approached. The air grew heavy. Then, knock, knock, knock. Lena's breath hitched. The sound echoed through the empty house, deliberate and unnerving. Her fingers tightened around the flashlight. "Probably just the wind," she muttered, though her voice wavered. She crept toward the door and hesitated before pressing her ear against the wood. Silence. No footsteps, no voices. Swallowing her nerves, she unlocked the door and flung it open. Nothing. The empty yard stretched before her, the moon casting long shadows over the dying grass. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off, shutting the door firmly behind her. It was just her imagination, or so she thought. Lena settled back into the living room, pretending her heart wasn't still racing. She played back the footage from her camera. The knocks were there, sharp, rhythmic, but the camera captured nothing unusual outside the door. Then, just as she was about to turn it off, something flickered on the screen. A shadow, not outside, behind her. Lena spun around, flashlight trembling in her grip, but the room was empty. Yet, a faint pressure pressed against her chest, a growing awareness that she was no longer alone. She decided to sleep with the lights on. The next morning, Lena left the house to clear her head. She grabbed breakfast at a diner and casually asked about the legend. An old woman at the counter stiffened. "You heard the knocks?" she asked in a hushed voice. Lena nodded, and the woman's face paled. "She knows you're there now." A cold dread settled in Lena's stomach. "Who?" The woman hesitated before whispering. "The girl." Years ago, a young girl had lived in that house. Some said she was a witch. Others claimed she was merely strange. One night, she vanished without a trace. Her family moved away, and the house stood empty ever since. But the knocking never stopped. Lena dismissed the story, but something about the woman's fear unsettled her. That night she returned to the house, determined to see this through. At midnight, knock, knock, knock. This time Lena didn't move. She stayed curled in her sleeping bag, heart hammering. The knocking came again, louder, more insistent, and then the door creaked open. Lena held her breath, her flashlight illuminating the empty hallway. But the air was colder now, thick with the scent of damp earth. A whisper curled through the darkness. "Let me in." Lena's body locked up in terror. The voice was soft, childlike, yet filled with something ancient and wrong. "No," she croaked. The whisper turned to a giggle, low, echoing, unnatural. Lena scrambled for her camera, but the screen glitched, static obscuring the footage. The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, a figure stood in the doorway. A girl, no older than 10, with tangled black hair and hollow, shadowed eyes. Her dress was old-fashioned, stained with something dark. Lena couldn't move. The girl smiled. "You answered." And then she rushed forward. Lena woke up outside the house. Her clothes were torn, her arms covered in scratches. The memory of the night was hazy, fragmented. Only flashes of a pale face, clawing hands, whispers burrowing into her mind. She stumbled back to town, dazed, only to be met with horrified stares. "Lena," Mark gasped, grabbing her shoulders. "You've been gone for 3 days." She didn't remember eating, drinking, breathing. And yet, she was alive. Barely. That night, as she lay in bed, trying to convince herself it was over. Knock, knock, knock. Lena bit back a scream, staring at her bedroom door. She had left the house, but the girl had followed. And this time, there was nowhere left to run. Story 5. The phone call from nowhere. The rain drummed against the window as David Collins sat in his dimly lit apartment, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. The glow from the screen illuminated his face, casting long shadows on the walls. It was just another uneventful Saturday night. Outside, the city was eerily quiet, muffled by the storm. David had always been a night owl, often staying up late watching horror movies or browsing forums about urban legends. But tonight, there was an unsettling stillness in the air, an inexplicable weight pressing on his chest. He shook the feeling off and reached for his cup of coffee, now cold and forgotten. Then his phone rang. The sudden sound made him jump. He frowned and glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. The time on the phone read 12:03 a.m. David hesitated before answering. "Hello." Silence. He frowned. "Hello. Who is this?" Still nothing. Just the faint crackling of static. He was about to hang up when a voice, distorted and distant, whispered, "Don't go outside." David's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" he demanded. No answer. The call ended abruptly. His heart pounded as he stared at his phone. Prank calls weren't unusual, but something about this one felt wrong. He exhaled and tried to brush it off. Probably some kid messing around. But deep down, an uneasy feeling nestled in his gut. Minutes passed. Then the phone rang again. David hesitated longer this time before answering. "Hello, David." His breath caught in his throat. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" "Don't go outside." A chill ran down his spine. The voice sounded different this time, closer, more urgent. The line went dead again. David sat frozen, gripping his phone tightly. He checked the call log. Unknown number. There was no way to call back. Lightning flashed outside, followed by a deep roll of thunder. The storm was getting worse. And then, the power went out. His apartment was plunged into darkness. David swallowed hard. He reached for the flashlight on his phone. But as soon as he turned it on, the phone rang again. He hesitated before answering, but something inside him needed to know. "Hello." This time there was breathing on the other end. Slow, ragged, inhuman. Then, tap, tap, tap. His body stiffened. That sound, it wasn't from the phone. It was coming from his window. David's hands trembled as he slowly turned his head toward the window. Outside, beyond the rain-streaked glass, a figure stood in the darkness, number not standing, watching. The figure was tall and thin, barely visible against the blackness of the stormy night. Its face was obscured, but David could feel its gaze piercing through him. Then his phone vibrated. A new text message. "Don't move." His pulse pounded in his ears. His mind raced. Who was this? How did they know where he was? He forced himself to look back at his phone, sweat dripping down his brow. Another text. "If you move, it will see you." David's breathing was shallow. He gripped the armrest of his chair, his body rigid with terror. His instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do something. And then the phone rang again. This time, it was different. The ringtone was distorted, glitching like a corrupted file. His thumb hovered over the screen. If he answered, what would happen? If he didn't, what would happen? Summoning all his courage, he pressed the answer button. "Hello," he whispered. The voice on the other end was right next to his ear. "It's inside." A slow creak echoed through his apartment, the sound of a door opening. But David hadn't moved. His eyes darted toward the bedroom door. It was open just a crack. He had closed it earlier. He was sure of it. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unnatural presence. He could hear it breathing, slow, wet, just beyond the doorframe. The phone vibrated again. Another text. "Run." David bolted from his chair, knocking over the coffee table. His heart hammered as he sprinted toward the front door, fumbling with the locks. His hands were slick with sweat. Behind him, the bedroom door creaked open wider. And then, the whisper. "David." It was no longer on the phone. It was in the room. David yanked the door open and stumbled into the rain-soaked hallway, slamming it shut behind him. His phone buzzed again in his shaking hands. A final message. "You shouldn't have gone outside." Lightning flashed, and for the first time, David saw them. Dozens of figures stood motionless in the hallway, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Then, the phone slipped from his grasp, the last thing he heard before the world went black. The phone ringing. 2 days later, David's apartment was found abandoned. The front door was open, his phone lying shattered on the floor. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of him, except for one thing. On his phone, a single missed call. From his own number. No one ever saw David Collins again. But sometimes, late at night, when the storm is heavy and the power flickers, a phone will ring in an empty apartment. And if you answer, you might hear a whisper. Don't go outside. Story 6. The Candle That Bleeds. The letter arrived on a damp autumn morning, its envelope yellowed with age. Eleanor Markham hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling slightly. She had never expected anything from her estranged uncle, Henry Blackwood, a man she had only met once as a child. Yet, his death had left her as the sole heir to Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Victorian estate nestled deep within the misty woods of Ravens Hollow. The town had always whispered about the Blackwood family, tales of madness, disappearances, and an ancient curse. But Eleanor, a rational woman, dismissed the stories. After all, what harm could an old house do? She packed her bags and drove for hours through winding country roads, the trees growing denser with each passing mile. When she finally reached the gates of Blackwood Manor, an eerie sensation settled over her. The mansion stood like a forgotten relic, its once grand facade crumbling under years of neglect. A single lantern flickered near the entrance, casting long, wavering shadows. Inside, The house was a museum of decay, dust-covered portraits, cobweb-laden chandeliers, and furniture draped in white sheets. As she explored, Eleanor found the study, where her uncle's belongings remained untouched. On the massive oak desk, a single object caught her attention. A candle unlike any she had seen before. It was deep crimson, almost black, and oddly waxy, as if made from something other than wax. The wick had already been burned once, though the candle was barely used. Beside it lay a note in her uncle's trembling handwriting. "Do not light the candle." Eleanor smirked. Superstition. Perhaps her uncle had been as mad as the rumours claimed. Still, a nagging curiosity grew within her. She left the study, determined to settle in before pondering over the candle any further. That night, as the wind howled outside, Eleanor struggled to sleep. The house groaned with age, the pipes moaned, and the floorboards creaked as if someone unseen walked through the halls. At midnight, a chill seeped into the room, making her skin prickle. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely discernible, coming from the study. Against her better judgment, she rose from bed, wrapping herself in a shawl. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching into the darkness. When she reached the study, the whispering ceased, but an overwhelming sense of unease filled the air. The candle. It had moved. Now sitting in the center of the desk, it almost seemed to pulse, as if something inside it was alive. Eleanor hesitated before striking a match. A foolish impulse. She needed light, reassurance that there was nothing to fear. The moment the flame touched the wick, the room plunged into darkness. The candle burned with an unnatural glow, dim yet penetrating. The wax, once solid, began to melt. But it wasn't wax. Thick, red liquid oozed down its sides, pooling at the base. The scent of iron filled the air. Blood. Eleanor stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The study door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The whispers returned, growing louder, turning into tortured moans. Then she saw them. Reflections in the tall glass window. Shadowy figures writhed, their faces twisted in agony. A deep voice rumbled from nowhere and everywhere. "You have awakened us." The candle flickered violently, and the figures stepped forward. Eleanor's breath hitched as she recognized one of them. Her uncle, Henry Blackwood. His eyes hollow, his mouth stitched shut with black thread. Through sheer force of will, Eleanor tore her gaze away. The blood from the candle spread like veins across the floor, reaching toward her feet. Desperate, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurled it at the candle. The flame extinguished instantly, and the room fell silent. For a moment, she thought it was over. Then a single drop of blood fell from the candle's wick, sizzling as it touched the wooden desk. Eleanor knew, with a terrible certainty, that she had not ended it. She had only begun. Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor spent the next day searching through her uncle's library. She found a journal hidden behind a row of dusty books. The candle must never be lit. It is not wax, but flesh. It is not flame, but hunger. It does not burn. It feeds. The entry spoke of an ancient ritual, of a deal struck centuries ago by an ancestor desperate for power. In exchange, the family was bound to the candle. Each new heir was warned never to light it, for doing so would awaken the spirits of those consumed by its curse. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had lit the candle, and now they were coming for her. That night, the house felt alive. Shadows moved where there was no light. Whispers coiled around her ears. Every door she tried was locked. Then she saw them again. Figures emerging from the candle's pool of blood. Hands reached for her, faces contorted in silent screams. Eleanor ran, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. The candle burned brighter, its flame turning blue. A voice echoed inside her head. "Stay. Join us." She screamed, knocking over a lantern. The fire spread quickly, licking at the walls. If she couldn't escape, she would destroy the house before the candle could take her. The fire consumed everything. Smoke filled her lungs as she stumbled out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. She turned back only once, to see the manor collapse into itself, the flames devouring its cursed walls. The candle was gone, or so she thought. Days later, as she settled into her apartment, a package arrived. No return address. With shaking hands, Eleanor unwrapped it. Inside was a single object, a crimson candle, the wick already burned, and from it, a single drop of blood fell onto her trembling fingers. Story 7. The Man Who Waits at the Corner. It started with something simple. An ordinary evening, a routine walk, and a shadow where it didn't belong. Michael Carter had lived in Hollowbrook for 2 years, a quiet town with narrow streets and old streetlights that flickered like dying fireflies. Every evening, after work, he took the same route home, down Ashwood Lane, past the abandoned bookstore, and through the intersection of Grayson and Elm. That was where he first saw him. A man stood at the corner, his face hidden beneath the brim of an old-fashioned hat. He wore a long black coat that seemed too heavy for the mild autumn night. He didn't move, didn't look around, just stood there facing forward, as if waiting for something. Michael frowned but kept walking. He had never seen the man before, but Hollowbrook was small, and strangers didn't go unnoticed for long. The next night, the man was there again. Same corner, same hat, same coat. Michael hesitated. Maybe the man was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just a drifter. Either way, it wasn't his business. But as he passed, he felt something. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like invisible fingers brushing his skin. He glanced back. The man was still there, still waiting. For a week, the man appeared at the same corner every night at exactly 9:15 p.m. He never moved, never acknowledged anyone, just stood, silent and still. Michael began to feel uneasy. He tried different routes home, but curiosity always pulled him back. And each night, without fail, the man was there. One evening, he decided to test something. He stopped at the opposite corner and stared at the stranger. Minutes passed. The man never moved. Michael took a step forward. The man's head tilted, just slightly. Not enough to be certain, but enough to send a chill through Michael's bones. That night, he dreamed of the man. In the dream, he was trapped in a place with no sky, no sun, just endless darkness and the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. When he woke, the clock read 3:33 a.m. Outside, down the street, he thought he saw a figure standing beneath the flickering streetlight, waiting. Determined to break the pattern, Michael decided to confront the man. He arrived at the corner at 9:14 p.m., his heart hammering. The street was empty, but the moment the clock on the church tower struck 9:15, the man was there. Michael stepped forward. "Who are you?" he asked. No response. "What do you want?" "Nothing." Michael reached out. The man's head snapped up. For the first time, Michael saw his face, pale, hollow, eyes like black holes, empty and endless. His mouth was slightly open, but there were no teeth, just a dark void that seemed to stretch forever. A whisper crawled into Michael's ears, though the man's lips never moved. "He waited for you. Now you wait for him." Michael stumbled back. The street around him warped, twisting like a melting painting. The man stepped forward, his body jerking unnaturally. Michael ran. The next day, Michael dug into the town's history. At the library, he found an old newspaper article from 1953. A man named William Grayson had been struck by a car at the very corner where Michael saw the stranger. Witnesses reported that he had been standing there for hours before the accident, as if waiting for something. His body was never found. Only his hat and coat remained. Michael's hands trembled as he read. Could it be the same man, or something worse? That night, Michael knew he had to end it. At 9:15, he returned to the corner. The man was there. Michael took a deep breath. What do you want from me? A gust of wind howled through the empty street. The man slowly raised a hand and pointed at Michael's feet. He looked down. The pavement beneath him was cracked, as if something had forced its way up from below. A whisper surrounded him, growing louder, shaping into words. You took my place. Michael's heart pounded. What? You waited. Now you stay. The world spun. The streetlights flickered. The man stepped closer, and Michael realized he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground. The stranger reached up and removed his hat. Michael screamed. The next morning, Hollowbrook continued as usual. People walked past the intersection of Grayson and Elm without a second thought. No one noticed the new man standing at the corner. A man in a long black coat. A man wearing a hat that shadowed his face. A man who never moved and never left. Waiting for the next one. Story 8. The Eyes in the Keyhole. Samuel never believed in ghosts. He was a man of science, a historian specializing in ancient artifacts. When he received a letter from a distant cousin about an old Victorian mansion up for inheritance, he thought nothing of it except as a mere formality. The house, known as Blackwood Manor, had stood for over a century, abandoned for decades after a series of mysterious deaths. Just an old house, he muttered, as he drove through the winding forest road, thick with mist. The house sat atop a hill, overlooking the darkened woods like a lonely sentinel. Upon arrival, the air was heavy with decay. The wood creaked beneath his feet as he pushed open the heavy front doors. The interior was grand but draped in dust and cobwebs. A chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals dulled by time. His cousin had left him a key and a letter. Be careful at night. Keep the doors locked. If you hear whispering, do not listen. And whatever you do, never look through the keyhole. Samuel scoffed, tossing the letter aside. He was alone in the house now, and he intended to stay only long enough to assess its value. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a mournful spirit. Samuel sat by the fireplace with a glass of brandy, flipping through a ledger of the house's history. The deaths were gruesome. Servants found hanged. The original owner, Lord Blackwood, was rumoured to have murdered his entire family before taking his own life. One report mentioned something living in the walls. A sudden knock at the door made him jump. Boom, boom, boom. He hesitated. Who would be out in this storm? He walked to the door but saw no one through the peephole. Then he noticed the keyhole. A strange sensation overtook him, an urge, a deep curiosity. He crouched and peeked through. A single eye stared back. He reeled back, heart hammering. The knock came again, harder this time. His breath came in short gasps, then silence. Samuel backed away, locking the door. The letter's warning echoed in his mind. He shook his head. Just my imagination. That night, he couldn't sleep. The rain continued, and every creak of the old house set his nerves on edge. The wind whistled through unseen cracks, forming whispers that seemed almost words. Then he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, just outside his bedroom door. Samuel grabbed the nearest thing, a brass candlestick, and approached the door. He could feel a presence on the other side. He crouched. His eye met the keyhole. And again, an eye met his. It was bloodshot, too large to be human. The pupil dilated unnaturally. Samuel stumbled back, choking on his own breath. The whispering grew louder. "Let me in. Let me in." He grabbed the key and locked the door. The whispering stopped. The next morning, Samuel decided he had had enough. He packed his things, but when he tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. Frustrated, he searched for another exit. The windows were all sealed shut, as if the house itself didn't want him to leave. That night, the knocking returned. Boom, boom, boom. Samuel held his breath. Boom, boom, boom. He covered the keyhole with tape, but still, he felt the presence. He could hear breathing on the other side. A low, rasping voice spoke through the door. "You saw me." The whispers turned into laughter. Then the door burst open. Darkness swallowed the room. Samuel woke up sprawled on the cold wooden floor. The house was silent, but something was wrong. His body felt weak and his vision blurred. He crawled to a mirror. His right eye was missing. A ragged, empty hole remained. Panicked, he touched his face, but no blood oozed. It was as if his eye had never been there. The whispers returned. "Now, you are one of us." Through the keyhole, someone else would look one day, and Samuel would be waiting. Story 9. The House That Whispers Your Name. Anna Caldwell never believed in ghosts. As a journalist for the Denver Chronicle, she specialized in debunking urban legends, exposing fraudulent psychics, and dismantling so-called haunted house myths. So when she received an anonymous email about Blackwood Manor, she almost deleted it. Go to Blackwood Manor. Stay one night. If you leave before sunrise, you will never be the same. But if you listen closely, it will whisper your name. Attached was a location in rural Colorado and a brief history. Blackwood Manor, built in 1896, had been abandoned since 1932, after the entire Blackwood family vanished without a trace. Locals believed the house was cursed. Anyone who stayed overnight either disappeared or went mad. It was perfect for Anna's next feature. Anna arrived in the late afternoon. The house sat alone at the top of a hill, surrounded by a decaying iron fence. The trees around it were lifeless, their twisted branches reaching toward the darkening sky. The house itself was massive, its Victorian architecture a shadow of its former grandeur. As she approached, the air felt thick. The house exhaled a deep silence, as if it were waiting. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. It groaned loudly, revealing a dust-covered interior frozen in time. The grand staircase loomed ahead, portraits of the long-gone Blackwood family lining the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow her. Anna set up her camera and digital recorder. "Let's see what's so scary about you," she muttered, pressing record. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house changed. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. At first, it was subtle. A floorboard creaked upstairs. A breath of cold air brushed against her neck. She dismissed it as the wind slipping through cracks in the old wood. Then she heard it. A whisper. Her name. Anna. She spun around, heart pounding. No one was there. Her hands trembled as she rewound the recording. Static. Silence. Then, "Anna, leave." The voice was distant, as if someone was trapped within the walls. She swallowed hard. Just a trick of the mind, she whispered. But doubt crept in. Determined to stay until dawn, Anna explored the house. She found old journals, fragments of letters, pieces of the Blackwood family's life before they disappeared. One diary belonged to Evelyn Blackwood, the eldest daughter. The whispers grow louder. Mother says it's just the wind, but I hear them calling our names. They say they want us to stay forever. Anna's stomach twisted. She flipped to the last entry, dated October 31st, 1932. Father has gone mad. He says the house speaks to him, tells him we must never leave. Mother cries at night. The whispers have stopped calling our names, because now they know us. Anna slammed the book shut. Suddenly, she wasn't alone. A shadow flickered in the dim light. Not a trick of her tired eyes. Something moved in the hallway. Then, the whispers came again, louder. Anna, stay. Anna bolted for the front door. She grabbed the knob, locked. She hadn't locked it. Her breath came in gasps as she yanked, twisted, pounded. Nothing. Behind her, footsteps crept closer. She turned. A figure stood at the top of the staircase. A man in old-fashioned clothing, his eyes hollow, face gaunt. His lips moved, but his voice was not his own. Stay. Anna stumbled backward. The whispers swarmed around her, rising to an unbearable cacophony. The portraits on the walls distorted. The Blackwoods' painted eyes bled black tears. She had to get out. Anna ran through the house, searching for another way out, but the layout seemed different. Corridors stretched longer. Doors led to rooms that shouldn't exist. A child's giggle echoed in the distance. Then, in the dim glow of her flashlight, she saw them. The Blackwood family, mother, father, children, all standing in the parlour, their expressions blank. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering a single word. Anna. She covered her ears. No, you're not real. The walls trembled. The ceiling groaned as if the house itself was breathing. We know you now, the voices sang. The shadows lunged. Anna ran. She didn't know where, only away. Then she saw it, a window. She hurled herself at it. Glass shattered, and she tumbled onto the cold, wet grass outside. Silence. The house loomed behind her, dark and still. The whispers had stopped. Shaking, bleeding from cuts on her arms, Anna crawled to her car, started the engine, and sped down the hill. She never looked back. Days passed. Anna tried to rationalize it. Hallucination, sleep deprivation, a trick of the mind. Then she heard it again, in her apartment, in her car, in her dreams. Anna. The house had let her go, but it had never forgotten her name. And now, it would never stop whispering. The end. Story 10. The thing under the floorboards. The old house on Hollow Street had stood for nearly a century, its wooden frame creaking with every gust of wind. It had once been a grand residence, but time had left it weathered and broken. The townspeople whispered about strange noises at night, scratching sounds, muffled cries, things moving when no one was there. Michael and Claire Thompson, a young couple looking for an affordable home, dismissed the rumours. They had heard all the ghost stories before. Every old house had them. Besides, they needed a fresh start away from the city. This place has charm, Claire said, running her fingers along the dusty banister. Yeah, if you like haunted mansions, Michael joked. The real estate agent, a wiry woman named Mrs. Holloway, simply smiled. The house has history, she said carefully. Still, the price was too good to pass up. They moved in a week later. The first few days were peaceful, if a little unsettling. The house groaned at night, and sometimes they thought they heard faint rustling. but they blamed it on the wind. Then, on the 5th night, Claire woke up to a sound, scratching, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere below the bedroom. "Michael," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Michael listened. There it was again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. "Probably mice," he muttered, rolling over. Claire wasn't convinced. The sound was too deliberate, too steady. It didn't stop until dawn. Determined to find the source, Michael bought mousetraps and set them up around the house. But the next morning, they remained untouched. That afternoon, Claire was cleaning when she noticed something strange. One of the wooden floorboards in the living room was slightly loose. She knelt down and pried it up. A gap of darkness yawned beneath the floor. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something cold and solid, a wooden box. Heart pounding, she pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside was an old yellow journal bound in cracked leather. The first page read, "If you are reading this, it is already too late. Do not listen to it. Do not answer it. Do not let it out." Claire's hands trembled as she turned the page. The journal belonged to a man named Henry Blackwood, who had lived in the house nearly 80 years ago. As Claire read, a terrible story unfolded. Blackwood had been tormented by something beneath the floorboards, something that whispered to him at night, begging to be freed. At first, he had resisted, but the whispers became louder, more insistent. It knew his name. It promised him things. It threatened him. He had sealed the thing beneath the floor, using rituals from an old book he had stolen from a monastery. But he feared it would not stay trapped forever. "It will try to trick you," the final entry warned. "Do not believe its lies." Just then, Claire heard it again, the scratching. Only this time, it was closer. That night, Claire and Michael lay in bed, wide awake. The sound had returned, louder than before. Then came the whisper. "Claire." She gasped and gripped Michael's arm. "Did you hear that?" Michael sat up, eyes wide. The whisper came again, slithering through the darkness like an unseen serpent. "Let me out. I'm so hungry." Michael grabbed a flashlight and stormed downstairs. "Who's there?" he demanded. Silence. Then, "Michael." He froze. The voice was under the floor, right beneath his feet. Claire showed Michael the journal the next morning. "We can't stay here," she insisted. Michael wasn't convinced. "It's just an old house making noises." But that night, the thing spoke again. "Please. It hurts." The voice was no longer whispering. It was crying. Michael's skepticism wavered. He pried up the loose floorboard, shining his flashlight into the darkness below. Dust swirled in the stale air. And then, movement. A skeletal hand shot up from the void. Michael screamed and fell backward as a figure began to rise. It was thin, impossibly tall. Its skin stretched tight over its bones. Hollow, black eyes stared up at him. Claire pulled him away, slamming the floorboard shut. The thing screamed, a terrible, piercing wail that made their ears bleed. But it was too late. They had broken the seal. The house trembled. The walls cracked. The thing beneath the floorboards was free. Darkness spilled from the gap, swallowing the room in shadow. The figure slithered forward, its elongated limbs twisting unnaturally. You should have listened. Michael and Claire ran. The front door wouldn't budge. Windows cracked and shattered. The thing moved faster than should have been possible, its voice in their heads, whispering their worst fears. Claire grabbed a fire poker and swung, but it passed through the creature like mist. Michael yanked her toward the basement. "The book," he gasped. The journal had mentioned a ritual. If Henry Blackwood had sealed it once, maybe they could do it again, in the basement. They found Blackwood's old bookshelf. The air was thick, suffocating. The creature was coming. Claire's shaking hands flipped through the journal. There's a binding ritual. We need salt, fire, and... The creature shrieked as it reached the doorway, its limbs twisting toward them. Michael grabbed a bag of salt from a shelf and began pouring it in a circle. Claire lit a match. This has to work. The thing lunged. The moment it crossed the salt, it let out a horrific scream. Claire tossed the match. The flames roared to life. The creature thrashed, its form unraveling into darkness. No, no. With one final wail, it vanished. The house was silent. The fire had burned the salt circle into the floor, sealing the thing away once more. Michael and Claire stumbled outside, gasping for air. They never returned. A month later, a for sale sign appeared in front of the house on Hollow Street, and beneath the floorboards, the scratching began again.